All right, so I will be talking about the Four Pests campaign. The Four Pests campaign was a part of a movement known as the Great Leap Forward, which took place from 1958 to 1962. This occurred while Mao Zedong was in charge and he was the chairman of China. He aimed to reinvent a newer and more developed China, and in doing so, he included new ways when it came to agriculture. He wanted to move China from an agricultural economy into a more modern industrial society to keep up with the westernized culture. So, in doing so, he tried to increase grain production through new agricultural methods. And these methods were just experimental. They had not been proven to produce a greater yield than what they previously used in China for farming. But nevertheless, he implemented these new methods to try to produce more grain. And all the farmers that had previously owned grain production farms, they were all required to work on government farms called collective farms that were controlled by the communists instead of working on their own private farms. In addition, the Four Pest campaign was created to help enhance the hygiene of the country and targeted specific pests. Everyone was encouraged to participate in killing them, from the young to the old. So the four pests. The four pests are the mosquitoes, flies, rats, and sparrows. And all of these were deemed destructive to China and unhygienic. The mosquito was targeted for bringing in malaria. The rats were targeted for bringing in the plague. The flies were targeted because they were just found widespread and were thought to be just pests and too many of them, so they had to get rid of them. And so, as we can see, 24 million pounds of mosquitoes were killed, 220 million pounds of flies were killed, 1.5 billion rats were killed. But what we want to focus on is the sparrow population. So the sparrows were targeted for actually a different reason, because they actually thought not that they brought the disease over, but that they were actual pests when it came to their crops. It was said that many people had observed the sparrows eating the grains that they had grown. So this bird was targeted in order to reduce the number of pests on crops and have a higher yield of crops as well. But what ended up happening was not foreseen. So the sparrow population was almost brought to extinction. It was estimated that about 1 billion sparrows were killed. And the locust population was no longer kept in check since their natural predator was eliminated. So the sparrows were actually not pests at all, and they were quite the opposite. The sparrows were key to pest control. So the real pests for the crops were actually the locusts. And without these sparrows able to eat them, the population of the locusts was just able to grow very quickly. They were able to reproduce, and then they had the Chinese's grain to feast on as well. So in the pictures, we can see the Chinese people holding sparrows, dead ones, hunting them out of trees, stringing them up, and it almost became like a competition to see who could kill as many sparrows or as many of the other pests as possible. Oftentimes, the government encouraged people to bang their pots and pans to get the sparrows out of the trees and keep them flying. And many of the sparrows have thought to have died from fatigue just because people were chasing them out of the sky and kept them flying basically until they died. Other sparrows were shot with guns or little, as seen in the other picture before. Let me see, right there. But yeah, for the most part, though, people just killed them whenever they could. If they found a nest in the tree, then they would smash the eggs and kill the chicks to just try to eradicate as much as possible. And as I mentioned, the locust population that actually fed on the grain, the real pest, was no longer kept in check, and the population was now able to grow, which became a really big problem as the ecological balance had been disrupted between the predator and prey populations. Okay, so the build-up to the disaster. So in addition to the sparrows and the other pests being killed, new agricultural methods cut back the amount of crop production and yields. So the new government-collected farms actually functioned very poorly since the new methods were actually really inefficient and they were not able to produce more grain. Furthermore, because the original plantation or farm, the original farmers that grew the grain before this new plan was implemented, their farms were all barren since they were not allowed to operate them. So there was no grain to push back on if this plan failed. Everything that was farm related was basically controlled by the government, and the people that ran the old farms were actually sent to either work on these collected farms or to work in the industrial field and help with the production of more steel. In addition, other natural disasters occurred, such as droughts, which exacerbated the already worsening conditions of the food supply. There was also excess rain, which caused flooding, and flooding is extremely harmful when it comes to growing crops because it can drown the plants and oftentimes like it could also uproot them and wash the plants away if it's just like constant rain. It ruins the soil as well if there's nothing for the crops to like grab onto in the ground if it's all just like soft and soggy. And up to 40,000 square miles were said to have been flooded. So with these droughts and then the floods and the poor agricultural methods, along with the death of the sparrows and the booming of the locust populations, we came to the big disaster. So the disaster was the Great Chinese Famine. The Great Chinese Famine occurred from all those inputs that I just mentioned, but a large part of it was because of the ecological disruption. So by 1959, 15% of China's crops had been lost, and by 1960, 70% of the grains and common crops were lost. Over 56.5 million tons of crops were lost during this time period, which was a significant loss to many of the poor people in China, as they had no food to really eat when their area was completely barren from all the locusts eating the foods or no food being sent to them because the government farms were not efficient and not sharing anything. So this led to many people just starving. And unfortunately, we can see in the pictures below the two kids on the left that are starving. And then we see the kid on the right who is collecting dry vegetation to eat because during this time period, people basically ate whatever they could find. Um, it is said that people were eating things like grass, sawdust, leather, even seeds sifted from animal manure because they really had nothing else to eat. It was also reported that peasants in Sichuan had been eating dirt to survive, unfortunately. And another thing that we saw was that the people were starving so badly that in order to curb their hunger, some people turned to cannibalism. And it's not really known how much cannibalism occurred during this time because it became like taboo to talk about afterwards, but there have been both official and unofficial accounts that it had occurred. People eating their own family members or dead corpses they found. In addition, people also ate cats, dogs, mice, insects, anything really that was alive or that they found they could eat. So after this whole famine, where 36 million were estimated to survive, that's like the number that most historians agree on, but it ranges up to like 45 million. Um, China actually had to have 250,000 sparrows imported from the Soviet Union to restore the ecological balance. Chairman Mao ended up having people stop killing the sparrows because the locust population was just getting way out of hand and people were dying. But he never, besides importing more sparrows, like he never helped the people that were starving. And that was one of the really bad things that came from this was it showed how bad the government was in China during this time, as it was also known that there were shipments of grain exported in China from 1959 to 1960, in which millions of tons of grain were sent away that could have been used to feed the people that were starving. But the government did not help out, even though they were the ones that caused this disaster in the first place. Okay, so moving on. So the lessons learned. So during this whole disaster, we learned that birds are critical to the ecosystem. As they had not known before, they thought birds were just the pests that were the ones taking away their food, but in fact, the sparrows were the ones that were controlling the pests in the first place. So when they disrupted this ecological balance, we see how a lot of crop was lost, and in turn, it ended up hurting the Chinese people. We also learned that maintaining ecological balances is very important, or else events like a trophic cascade can occur, which is basically what happens here. It's when a part of the ecosystems, maybe an animal is removed, and then the prey population can like boom, which in turn then causes them to overeat the vegetation, which could then impact other parts of the ecosystem. But basically, it's when part of the ecosystem is disrupted and it has like a chain domino effect on all the rest of the organisms within the ecosystem. So we learned the importance of keeping an ecological balance, and that species have critical roles in nature that we rely on for their existence. Without these birds, we can obviously see that the Chinese people suffered poorly because of their food loss from all the locusts consuming their food that they were supposed to eat. So it's important to know that we rely on nature in so many ways, and yet we're still like destroying it in a million ways, as we can obviously have learned from this class. But that was one thing that was emphasized, was that they needed the birds and they destroyed them, and this is what happened. And it's terrible that it could have been prevented, but a big lesson for everyone else in the future. And then also, just to not fix what's broken, the agricultural methods that he implemented that were new turned out to be inefficient and hurt the problem even more. There's nothing they could have done about the natural disasters, but the other two they could have definitely changed or not have done in the first place, which would have helped a lot of people live. But yeah, this was just a terrible disaster in which millions of people died, all because of Chairman Mao just controlling China and changing a bunch of, implementing a bunch of new things to reinvent China that had very dire consequences on the people. So the references I use are listed here. But that is the end. Thanks for listening.